point a million times.
What am I going to say?
You're going to say there's no mitzvah to live in Israel when it's run by a secular government.
I'm going to say more than that. He's saying that the greatest Jewish accomplishments and achievements, the place for that is the state of Israel. And I'm going to say
the land of Israel.
The land of Israel, which is right now under the control of the state of Israel. And I'm going to argue against that and say no. The greatest Jewish accomplishments and achievements in history took place in Babylon. It's brought down that our greatest learning, and at a time when we were at the holiest time in our history, when the most amount of Jews were learning the most amount of Torah, we learned best in Babylon. And that is why, this is very important, that is why we call it the Babylonian Talmud. That the Jews who learned in Babylon were always at a higher learning level than were the Jews that lived in the land of Israel. And that is why today that we hold by Beis Hillel and not Beis Shammai. Because Beis Hillel was learning and had learned from the Gedolim in Babylon, while Beis Shammai had strictly lineage had stayed in Eretz Yisrael. And after a certain amount of years, Hillel and his academies were much higher than Shammai and his academies. Because you can learn better and more peacefully, we did so in Babylon. Babylon is where we were at our highest level of learning after, let's say, the fall of the first Beis Hamikdash, because prior to that, there was no Babylon. But after the fall of first Beis Hamikdash, from that point forward, for the next 1,000 years, the best learning was in Babylon, and it is unparalleled in our history from that point forward. America today is the new Babylon. We can sit here and we can learn in peace, and we can make tremendous accomplishments in Torah right here. In the state of Israel, what's going on there? There's a constant state of war. Israel is constantly attacked. They're in war and people are getting killed. It's not a place where it's safe. This is a direct comparison to how it was, let's say, during the Second Temple period. During the Second Temple period, the people who were learning in Babylon were learning at a higher level and doing so in peace than were the Jews who remain in Eretz Yisrael. That is the same situation today, and that is why the bigger learners, you have a much better chance and you're much safer here in the new Babylon, which is America. Also want to say, the idea that it's a greater achievement to do a mitzvah in Eretz Yisrael, I would argue against that. It's a greater achievement to do a mitzvah in Chutz Li'aretz. Because when you're in Chutz Li'aretz, right, and nobody's doing what you're doing, you're like Avraham Avinu. We just talked about that, right? You're doing something in a place where nobody around you, let's say, is necessarily Jewish, or no one around you is from, and you're doing these mitzvahs there. But when you do a mitzvah in Eretz Yisrael, and everybody around you is Jewish, like, what's the big deal? Like, what's the effort? What avoda have you put in? What effort have you put in to do a mitzvah, to be from? And when you're surrounded by frumies, it would take an effort not to be from. So I say you get a better. It shows a harder work and a greater accomplishment and a bigger achievement to stay from and to become from in Chutz Li'aretz. Okay.
That means the land outside of Israel.
A land outside of Israel. All right.
Okay, so I've been to shul many times, and I've had different rabbis, and when you show up to the same shul every day and you pray there every day, you really get to know your rabbi. So, like, I've had some rabbis who, like, lived for attention. Like, they just love to get their name in the newspaper.
Right.
They just love that. Then other rabbis just love to be with us. Just love to be with the stars. They just loved to be with celebrities. Like, that was their highlight. For other rabbis, their highlight was like political action, and whether it's the Democratic Party or for the Republican Party, they were like really, really into politics. Then you meet the occasional, like, the impressive rabbi who's like into Torah, who's into being a good person, who's into helping other people. yet isn't so needy for you to love him that he'll compromise on right and wrong. But this is a rabbi who stands for right and wrong, wants to help people, but he's not going to compromise Torah to do it. He's not going to like water down the Torah to become more popular. But like when you daven every day with people, you really get to know them well. And so they're like, some people are just like, oh, they're just like yearning to be more popular. They're yearning to be loved, or they're yearning to, let me do something really innovative so I get in the Jewish Journal. And then there are rabbis who stand for what's right and try to help people within the boundaries of Torah. And they're the most impressive ones, like when you meet a true Torah personality. So Abraham was like a true Torah personality. His influence flowed from his personality, from his behavior, rather than from public pronouncements or ideological statements. Like some rabbis, some religious leaders, they just live to be on stage. Like they're at their best, they're most human in the best sense when they're speaking in front of 500 people. They just feed off the attention, the love, and they're very eloquent, and they can say, fascinating and beautiful things when they're up in front of hundreds of people. But in their daily observance, it's not so impressive. So I find the religious personality, his influence flows from his personality, from his behavior, from the quiet things that he does, rather than from his grand public announcements or ideological statements. I find the quiet worker who embodies decency, goodness, God, commandments, I find that type the most impressive. And that's Abraham. He's not like going on TV and making grand statements. So Abraham fed the hungry, he befriended the lonely, he remained loyal to those who were really no longer worthy of his loyalty. He called out the name of God wherever he was. People saw in him that he was a special person, unique figure, a hero of spirit and action. People saw God in him, and that's what Abraham achieved. And there are still people like that. Like right here in P.K. Robertson, there are people who like not seeking the limelight, not seeking desperately for you to love them, to pay attention to them. They're just seeking to do what's right. I find those type of people impressive. By contrast, like in Western society, it's essentially rootless. You don't find generations of people at the same house of worship so often anymore, except in Orthodox Judaism and traditional Christianity. You see people just pursuing pleasure, such as like women who can offer you the 3 orifices simultaneously. People just pursuing instant gratification at almost all costs. I got to admit, there have been times in my life where like I can't sleep and I think, I've got to see a blonde woman with really big breasts getting it from at least 5 guys at once. Sick. And I just want to see it covered in their DNA, and I want her to be wearing like lingerie while this is going on. And I want her to look kind of innocent, and I want to see her being really violated. Like, I admit that. I have had those yearnings go through my head. It's like, and I've got to have that or I just can't sleep. I've just got to have that instant gratification or I just can't sleep. And that's my sex addiction calling out, and it's not the Torah's way, but that's the way of much of Western civilization. It's like, oh, I've got to have my beer, or I've got to watch my sports, or I've got to go to my pole dancing class. I've got to go, I've got to go shopping and buy some new heels, or I'm just not going to be human. So people who are unwilling to sacrifice for the future or for others, they suffer from a lack of heroes and role models. They suffer from a presence of herpes and other STDs. In the Western society, we venerate sports stars, movie actors, princesses, and politicians. These are not the type of people to venerate. It's like people like Abraham and then good, solid, decent people all around us here in P.K. Robertson. And like one of the main reasons that I became an Orthodox Jew is that I found a higher proportion of good people in Orthodox Judaism than outside of Orthodox Judaism. Like, I'm cool with a lot of Reform and Conservative Judaism. I find it interesting. I like the music. I like that they play musical instruments on Shabbat. I enjoy the Kiddush. Like, often the women don't have as many sexual hang-ups.